The morning kicked off like any other, the steady drone of the washing machine in the background and the faint aroma of coffee hanging in the air. Emily sat at the kitchen table, flipping through a catalog she didn't really need. The glossy pages offered a temporary escape from the monotony of her life. 50 wasn't old, she kept telling herself, but it sure felt that way when every day seemed to bleed into the next. Quick narrator note, man, I can already feel the weight of her routine. It's like life's on autopilot, and you're just along for the ride. Been there, and it's not fun. Her husband, Ryan, had left early that morning for yet another business trip. He barely managed a grunt of a goodbye as he grabbed his suitcase and headed out. The sound of the front door slamming shut echoed through the house, leaving Emily alone with the kind of silence that settles in when two people forget how to really talk to each other. Their conversations had become purely functional: grocery lists, bills, the occasional half-hearted, "How was your day?" that neither of them actually cared about. That's why, on a whim, Emily had ordered something she hadn't dared to in years. The silky lingerie set had arrived in a plain brown package earlier that week, and she'd been too nervous to open it until now. She carried the box to her bedroom, feeling a mix of excitement and embarrassment. What was she even doing? Ryan hardly noticed when she wore makeup, let alone something provocative. Still, as she slipped the fabric over her skin, a spark of something she couldn't quite put into words, flickered to life. Standing in front of the mirror, she adjusted the straps and smoothed the delicate lace against her body. It hugged her in ways that felt unfamiliar but thrilling. For the first time in years, she saw more than just Ryan's wife. She saw Emily, a woman who still had something to offer. She ran her fingers along the edge of the silky fabric, letting the texture glide beneath her fingertips. A soft smile tugged at her lips as she studied her reflection, her cheeks faintly flushed. Another narrator aside, you know, it's sad how easy it is to lose yourself in a marriage. Sometimes it takes something small, like a piece of clothing, to remind you who you are. But man, the timing here, it's about to get awkward. Just as she leaned in closer to inspect the lace trim, the sharp chime of the doorbell shattered the moment. Emily flinched, her heart leaping into her throat like she'd been caught doing something wrong. She glanced at the clock on the wall and frowned. She wasn't expecting anyone. The package she'd ordered earlier in the week wasn't due until tomorrow. Panicking, she grabbed her robe from the bed and threw it on hastily, the satin lingerie still cool against her skin. She tightened the robe's belt and hurried to the door, her hands trembling slightly. One last look in the mirror betrayed her flustered state. Her cheeks were glowing, and her hair had that just must look that gave away how she'd spent her afternoon. Taking a deep breath, she padded barefoot to the door, the hardwood floor cool beneath her feet. Probably just the delivery guy running early, she muttered to herself. Or maybe a neighbor needing something. But when she opened the door, her assumptions fell apart. It wasn't a stranger, it was Jake. "Hey, Aunt Emily," he greeted her with that easy, boyish grin she remembered so well. Jake stood on the doorstep, tall and broad-shouldered, his presence somehow larger than she'd expected. At 22, he'd clearly grown into a man, though traces of the kid he used to be lingered in his smile. His dark hair was damp, clinging to his forehead, and beads of sweat trailed down his temples, evidence of hard work outside. The earthy scent of grass and sunshine seemed to follow him in. "Sorry to drop by unannounced," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I just came to grab those tools Uncle Ryan borrowed last week. Figured I'd stop by on my way home." Emily blinked, momentarily thrown by his sudden appearance. "Oh, Jake, hi," she managed, her voice a little shaky as she instinctively pulled her robe tighter. It had been months since she'd seen him, not since the family barbecue last summer. "The tools," she repeated absently, her mind racing to catch up. "Right, the tools. They're in the garage." "Thanks," he replied, stepping inside without hesitation. His boots left faint scuffs on the doormat, a detail Emily fixated on as she tried to steady herself. She closed the door behind him but couldn't help noticing how he seemed to fill the room with his presence. When had he become this grown-up version of himself? He wasn't the lanky teenager who used to lounge in her basement, glued to his video games with a bag of chips always within reach. Jake tilted his head, his warm brown eyes narrowing slightly in concern. "You okay, Aunt Emily? You look, I don't know, a little flustered." His tone was casual, but there was a hint of curiosity there, like he'd picked up on her nervous energy. Emily let out a nervous laugh, waving a hand dismissively. "Oh, I'm fine. Just, tidying up. You know how it is." Her voice came out a little higher than usual, and she cringed internally at how transparent her lie was. "The tools are in the garage. Let me grab them for you." Jake held up a hand, flashing her an easy smile. No need. I can get them myself. Don't trouble yourself. No, it's fine, Emily insisted quickly, already moving toward the hallway that led to the garage. The last thing Emily wanted was for Jake to wander around and stumble across the open lingerie box she'd left on the kitchen counter. He trailed behind her, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his worn jeans. She was hyper-aware of his presence, the faint sound of his footsteps echoing in the quiet as they walked side by side. His gaze, steady and unyielding, lingered on her back, sending an unexpected shiver down her spine. It was a sensation that both unsettled and intrigued her, one she couldn't quite shake. Narrator's note: oh, this is getting tense. You can feel the awkwardness in the air, like a storm brewing. And let's be real, Emily's not exactly helping herself here. Once they reached the garage, Emily stepped forward and gestured toward the corner where a red metal toolbox sat on a dusty workbench. Here it is, she said, her voice steady even though her heart was beating a little faster than usual. Everything Ryan borrowed should be in there. I made sure to put it all back last week. Thanks, Jake replied, his voice warm and casual as he crouched beside the toolbox. He opened the lid, his movements smooth and deliberate, his broad shoulders flexing as he sifted through the assortment of tools. Emily watched him silently, leaning against the doorway with her arms crossed in an attempt to look nonchalant. But she couldn't stop her eyes from wandering. He had changed so much in what felt like no time at all. His once boyish face was sharper now, framed by a jawline that hinted at maturity. The ease with which he moved, the quiet confidence he exuded, it was magnetic in a way she hadn't anticipated. It left her feeling unmoored, a little unsteady. She cleared her throat, desperate to fill the silence before it became too heavy. So, she began, her tone light but forced, how's school? Jake glanced up, the corners of his mouth lifting into a small smile. Good, he said simply. Actually, I graduated last month. Graduated? Emily blinked, her surprise genuine. Oh, Jake, that's wonderful. Why didn't anyone tell me? He shrugged, his expression softening with a hint of shyness. It's not a big deal, he said, brushing off her excitement. Just a 2-year program. But thanks. It feels good to be done. Emily frowned slightly, guilt creeping into her chest. When had the gap between her and her family widened so much? Why hadn't she known about this milestone? You should have said something, she said, her voice tinged with regret. We could have celebrated. You've worked so hard. Jake stood up then, brushing his hands off on his jeans before meeting her gaze. There was a spark of something unreadable in his eyes, a warmth that made her breath catch. Well, he said, his tone shifting to something lighter, more playful, maybe we can celebrate now. Emily tilted her head, confused. Now? Yeah, he replied, his voice casual but the intensity of his eyes betraying him. If you're free, I'd love to take you out for coffee or something. Just a little thank you for everything you've done for me. She stared at him, caught off guard. Coffee? She repeated, as though the word itself were foreign. Jake nodded, a slow, easy grin spreading across his face. You've always been there for me, Aunt Emily. I feel like I owe you at least that much. She hesitated, her mind racing. His words were genuine, his tone sincere, and yet the suggestion, so simple on the surface, made her stomach flutter in a way she hadn't felt in years. You deserve a break, he added gently, his voice softening further. Just an hour. Unless, of course, you've got other plans. A soft laugh escaped her lips before she could stop it. Plans? She echoed, shaking her head. No, not really. His grin widened, and he took a small step closer. Great, he said, his voice infused with quiet confidence. It's a date, then. The word hung between them, heavier than either of them seemed ready to acknowledge. Emily's breath hitched, and for a moment, the air seemed to thrum with unspoken energy. In that fleeting second, she felt alive in a way she hadn't in what felt like an eternity. The feeling was exhilarating, and terrifying. Narrator's aside, oh boy. It's a date? That's a loaded word, Jake. And Emily's not exactly shutting it down. This is a slippery slope, folks. Even after Jake left the garage, the echo of his words and the subtle intensity of his gaze lingered. Ryan's return home that evening brought no relief. Their exchanges had become routine, devoid of warmth or depth, reduced to mundane discussions about schedules and errands. If he noticed her distraction, he gave no sign of it. And Emily, consumed by the strange new emotions stirring within her, wondered bitterly if he even cared enough to notice. Jake, however, refused to let Emily retreat into herself. At first, his messages were light and casual, brief updates about his day at work, snapshots of colorful sunsets, and little jokes that managed to coax a smile from her even as she wrestled with her inner turmoil. But as the days turned into weeks, his tone shifted. His texts grew more thoughtful, more deliberate, as if he were carefully crafting a bridge to reach her. "I can't stop thinking about our coffee," read one message, straightforward yet charged with unspoken emotion. Another came unexpectedly late at night. "You're amazing. Don't ever let anyone make you forget that." Each time Jake's name lit up her screen, Emily's heart would pound uncontrollably. She told herself repeatedly that she needed to draw a line, to set a boundary that couldn't be crossed. Yet, instead of shutting him out, she found herself replying. Her responses, once brief and guarded, began to lengthen. She wrote with a warmth and candor she hadn't allowed herself to express in years. Slowly, she let her walls come down, one carefully placed brick at a time. Then came the message that changed everything. "Can I see you again?" Just as Emily's breath caught as she read the words, her pulse roared in her ears, drowning out every rational thought. Her fingers hovered hesitantly over the screen as she wrestled with the familiar pull of caution and the thrilling tug of desire. Before she could talk herself out of it, she typed a single word, "tomorrow," and hit send. Narrator's note: "Oh, Emily. You're playing with fire here." One word, and it's like she's opened a door she can't close. I can already feel the tension building. The next evening, true to his word, Jake pulled up in his car to pick her up. When she stepped outside and slid into the passenger seat, he greeted her with a wide grin that made his eyes sparkle like sunlight glinting off water. "You look incredible," he said softly, his deep voice carrying a weight of sincerity that made her heart skip a beat. Emily glanced down at her simple outfit, a plain blouse paired with her favorite jeans, and felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "You're too kind," she replied, her voice trembling slightly as she tried to mask the fluttering excitement stirring within her. Jake drove them to a secluded park on the outskirts of town, a place he had discovered years ago and often returned to when he needed peace. It was a haven, quiet and serene, where tall trees swayed gently in the evening breeze, and the rhythmic chirping of crickets filled the air. The fading sunlight painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the ground. They strolled along a narrow, winding trail that snaked through the woods, their steps unhurried, their conversation flowing naturally. Laughter punctuated their words, echoing softly in the stillness around them. Jake recounted amusing anecdotes from his college days, stories filled with youthful ambition, missteps, and humor. Emily listened, smiling at his enthusiasm, and in turn, she opened up about her own past, sharing glimpses of a younger, more carefree version of herself, a version she rarely spoke about, even to herself. Narrators aside, it's funny how easy it is to forget who you used to be. Sometimes it takes someone else to remind you. But this feels like more than just reminiscing. As they reached a clearing where a small bench sat beneath an old oak tree, Jake suddenly stopped walking. His laughter faded, and his expression turned thoughtful, almost hesitant. "I don't think I've ever seen you like this," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made Emily pause. "Like what?" she asked, turning to face him. "Happy," he replied simply. His words hung in the air, their honesty catching her off guard. Emily looked at him, startled by the intensity of his gaze. It was as if he were searching for something unspoken in her eyes. She felt her cheeks flush and quickly glanced away, her fingers instinctively fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "I don't know if I'd call it that," she murmured, her voice soft. "I would," he said, stepping closer to her. His tone was steady, almost reverent. "You light up when you laugh. It's beautiful." Emily's breath hitched at his words. The sincerity in his voice made her heart race, and the air between them seemed to grow heavier. There was an undeniable tension now, a fragile thread binding them in a moment that felt too significant to ignore. "Jake," she began, her voice uncertain, but he interrupted gently. "This is wrong," he said, his words hanging in the air like a confession. Emily's chest tightened. She forced herself to meet his eyes, her own filled with conflict. "Because I don't feel that way, Jake," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm your aunt. This can't happen." "But it's already happening," he countered, his voice low but unwavering. He reached out tentatively, his fingers brushing against hers. The touch was light, fleeting, but it sent a jolt through her, igniting something she had tried to suppress. "Tell me you don't feel it too," he added, his tone almost pleading. Emily wanted to retreat, to deny everything and create a wall between them that couldn't be crossed. But she couldn't. Her body betrayed her, leaning into his touch even as her mind screamed for her to stop. I don't know what I feel, she whispered, her words barely audible. Then let me show you, he said softly, his hand lifting to cup her cheek. The warmth of his touch sent shivers down her spine. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, it felt as though time had ceased to exist. The world around them dissolved, leaving only the two of them in that fragile, forbidden moment. Slowly, almost hesitantly, Jake leaned in. His lips brushed against hers in a kiss so delicate it was barely there, as though he was afraid of shattering the moment. Emily froze, every instinct telling her to pull away, to end this before it went any further. But the years of loneliness, the buried emotions, and the aching need for connection overwhelmed her. Her heart surged forward, silencing her mind, and she kissed him back. The kiss deepened, an unspoken outpouring of everything they had kept hidden. It was a mixture of longing, confusion, and desperation, the culmination of feelings neither of them had dared to name until now. Narrator's note: oh, man. This is it. The point of no return. You can feel the weight of this moment, like the whole world just shifted. When they finally pulled apart, the spell was broken. Emily stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth as though to erase what had just happened. Her breathing was uneven, her mind spinning with the implications of what they had done. This is insane, she said, her voice shaky and filled with panic. I don't care, Jake replied firmly, his eyes burning with conviction. His voice was steady despite the turmoil in the air. I've cared about you for so long, Aunt Emily. And I know you feel the same. Emily stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of his words settled over her, and she realized that no matter how much she wanted to deny it, some part of her couldn't. She shook her head, the weight of reality pressing down on her shoulders like a suffocating shroud. I have to go, she murmured, her voice barely audible over the thundering of her heart. Turning abruptly, she avoided Jake's gaze, unable to face the raw emotion she knew was etched across his face. This was a mistake, she added, her tone resolute though her trembling hands betrayed her inner turmoil. Wait, Jake called after her, his voice cracking with desperation. Please don't shut me out, talk to me. But Emily didn't stop. Each step away from him felt like a battle against herself. She hurried back to his car, her thoughts a chaotic whirlwind of guilt, longing, and fear. She couldn't look at him as they drove back. The tension in the car was thick, the silence punctuated only by the soft hum of the engine. When they reached her house, she muttered a quick, almost inaudible, "Thank you," before slipping out of the car. Her eyes remained fixed on the ground as she disappeared through the door, shutting the world, and Jake, out behind her. That night, Emily sat alone in her dimly lit bedroom, the only light coming from the soft glow of her bedside lamp. Her reflection stared back at her from the mirror, her expression haunted. She pressed her fingertips to her lips, which still tingled from the kiss that had turned her world upside down. Her heart ached, torn between the promises she had made and the emotions that now threatened to consume her. She thought of Ryan, of their years together, the life they had built, the vows they had exchanged. But every time she closed her eyes, it wasn't Ryan's face she saw, it was Jake's. His piercing gaze, the way he had looked at her as if she were the only person who mattered in the world. Narrator's note: oh, Emily. You're in deep now. The guilt's written all over her face, but so is the longing. This is a mess waiting to explode. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, cutting through the oppressive silence of the room. Emily didn't need to check to know who it was. She could feel it. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, the weight of her choices making her movements slow and deliberate. The message on the screen made her heart clench. I'll give you space if that's what you need. But I'm not giving up on you. Emily let out a shaky breath, tears welling in her eyes. Her emotions raged like a storm, colliding and intertwining, each one more powerful than the last. She set the phone down, her decision still a blur of uncertainty, and crawled into bed. But sleep eluded her, and she lay awake, her mind replaying the kiss, Jake's voice, and the enormity of the storm she had unleashed. The days that followed passed in a haze. Emily tried to lose herself in the monotony of her routine, cleaning, errands, work, but nothing seemed to distract her from the memory of Jake. His kiss lingered on her lips like an echo she couldn't silence. Every glance at her phone felt like a gamble. Half of her prayed for another message from him, while the other half dreaded the temptation it would bring. But Jake didn't stay silent for long. One evening, as Emily sat finishing dinner, her phone vibrated on the table, its sudden buzz making her heart skip a beat. She glanced at it, her breath catching as she read his message. I left something for you on the porch. I hope you'll take it. Her stomach churned as she set her fork down. Across the table, Ryan was engrossed in the evening news, his attention fully absorbed by the flickering images on the screen. Emily's pulse quickened. Mumbling something vague about needing fresh air, she excused herself and slipped out the front door, the cool night air brushing against her flushed cheeks. On the porch swing sat a small, unassuming envelope. Her name was scrawled across the front in Jake's familiar handwriting. The sight of it sent a shiver down her spine. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, her heart pounding like a drum. Inside was a simple note. "Meet me in the park tonight, please." Emily's initial instinct was to tear the note apart, to rid herself of the temptation. She had told herself that what happened between them was a mistake, a moment of weakness, nothing more. But as she stood there, staring at the note, the ache in her chest refused to be ignored. It was a longing she couldn't rationalize away. She returned inside, her mind racing. Ryan didn't notice her restless pacing as she wandered aimlessly around the living room, her thoughts battling between reason and desire. Finally, as the hours crept by, she made up her mind. Grabbing her coat, she called out, "I'm heading out to pick up some milk," her voice stiff but steady. Without waiting for a response, she stepped into the night, the note still clutched tightly in her hand. The park was enveloped in an eerie stillness, its winding paths deserted and bathed in the dim amber glow of streetlights. Their light spilled across the damp ground, stretching into elongated shadows that seemed to mirror the weight of the night. Emily hesitated at the entrance, her heart heavy with doubt, before she spotted Jake sitting on a lone bench by the pond. His figure was hunched, his shoulders taut, as if carrying the burden of unspoken words. The soft lapping of water against the edge of the pond only heightened the tension in the air. When Jake noticed her approach, he rose swiftly, a mixture of relief and longing washing over his face. His movements were uncertain, his hands diving into the pockets of his jacket, searching for an anchor in the storm of emotions. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he admitted, his voice low, almost drowned out by the gentle rustling of the trees. "I shouldn't have," Emily replied, though her tone faltered, lacking the conviction that her words should have carried. Her gaze darted to the ground as she fought to suppress the conflict raging within her. "Jake, this is..." "Don't say it's wrong," he cut her off, his words sharp but tinged with desperation. He stepped closer, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "You can't tell me you didn't feel it too. That kiss, it wasn't just in my head. It meant something." Emily's breath hitched, the memory of that forbidden moment flashing vividly in her mind. "It doesn't matter what it meant," she said, her voice trembling. "You're my nephew, Jake. This can't happen." "It doesn't have to be anyone's business," he insisted, his words spilling out in a rush. "This isn't about them. It's about us." His hand reached toward hers, his touch hesitant but electric. The warmth of his fingers against her own stirred emotions she had buried long ago. "You make me feel alive, Aunt Emily," Jake confessed, his voice cracking as he poured out his heart. "Like I matter. Like I'm more than just some lost kid trying to figure out who he's supposed to be. Don't take that away from me." Emily's heart twisted at his vulnerability, the rawness in his voice cutting through her defenses. She wanted to turn away, to run before the fragile line between them shattered entirely. But the weight of his words anchored her in place. "Jake, I can't give you what you're looking for," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You already have," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "You just don't want to see it." The silence that followed was deafening, the air between them heavy with the unspoken truths they were both too afraid to fully acknowledge. Suddenly, a sharp crack of thunder rolled through the park, and rain began to fall, its icy drops stinging Emily's skin. Without hesitation, Jake grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the nearby gazebo. The shelter was small, its wooden beams worn and creaking under the weight of the downpour. The rain created a cocoon around them, isolating them further from the world beyond. Emily's chest heaved with the weight of her emotions, her pulse pounding in her ears as Jake stepped closer. His eyes searched hers, filled with a mix of determination and vulnerability. "Tell me you don't feel it," Jake murmured, his voice barely more than a plea. "If you say you don't, I'll walk away. I promise." Emily's lips parted, but no words came. The truth tangled with the lies she wanted to tell. I don't know," she finally admitted, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. "This is too much, Jake. Too fast, too wrong." "Then let me slow it down," he whispered, his voice steady as he reached up to brush a damp strand of hair from her face. His touch was gentle, disarming, and for a fleeting moment, Emily allowed herself to close her eyes, to imagine a world where this connection wasn't forbidden. "This is madness," she murmured, her forehead leaning against his, her voice barely audible above the patter of rain. "Maybe, he replied, a bittersweet smile ghosting across his lips. But it's our madness. Before she could overthink, his lips found hers again, this time with an urgency that spoke of unspoken fears and unmet desires. The kiss deepened, silencing the voices in her head and drowning out the world beyond their small sanctuary. For those few seconds, nothing else existed. But the fragile moment shattered as a beam of light pierced through the darkness, illuminating the gazebo in a harsh glow. Emily pulled back abruptly, her heart plummeting as her eyes found the source. A figure stood at the edge of the park, motionless but unmistakable. Ryan. Ryan, Emily breathed, her voice breaking with shock, guilt, and something darker, betrayal. Panic surged through her veins as she stumbled backward. Ryan, I can explain, she began, her words faltering under the weight of the reality crashing down around her. Explain what? He asked, his voice rising, edged with a bitterness that sent shivers through the rain-soaked air. That you're out here in the middle of the night with him? Jake stepped forward, his jaw tight, his posture defiant despite the tension crackling between them. Uncle Ryan, I don't, Ryan barked, his voice sharp and commanding, cutting through the night like a whip. His glare was fierce, unrelenting, daring anyone to challenge him. Just don't. Emily's chest tightened, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on her as she instinctively stepped between them, her hands trembling. Ryan, please. It's not what it looks like, she implored, her voice faltering under the intensity of his gaze. His eyes bore into hers, a mix of anger and pain that made her stomach churn. Then what is it, Emily? He demanded, his voice cracking, the vulnerability behind his anger surfacing for just a moment before he buried it again beneath his fury. Because it sure as hell doesn't look innocent. Rain dripped steadily from Emily's hair, plastering it to her face as her thoughts raced, grasping for something, anything, that could diffuse the storm building before her. Jake reached out, placing a tentative hand on her shoulder, but she shrugged it off with a sharp movement, her desperation to take control clear in the gesture. Go home, Jake, she said, her voice breaking despite her effort to sound firm. Please, just go. I can't just leave, he cried, his voice raw, echoing the turmoil etched across his face. His words carried a weight that crushed her further, and for a fleeting moment, she wanted to take it all back, to fix the mess she had created. But Jake hesitated, the conflict in his eyes evident as the rain streamed down his face. After what felt like an eternity, he finally turned and walked away, his silhouette swallowed by the darkness, leaving only the sound of his retreating footsteps. Emily's heart sank as she turned back to Ryan, her body trembling under the weight of his piercing stare. His pain was etched so clearly in his features, it was almost unbearable to look at him. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. We'll talk about this at home, he said, his voice flat and cold, each word like a dagger. Without waiting for her response, he turned and headed toward the car, his movements rigid with suppressed emotion. For a moment, Emily remained rooted to the spot, the rain soaking her to the bone as the realization of what had just happened settled in her chest like a heavy stone. She had crossed a line she could never uncross, and the fragile foundation of her life now felt like it was crumbling beneath her feet. The car ride home was suffocating. The rhythmic thrum of the rain against the windshield mirrored the storm raging in Emily's mind. Ryan's knuckles were white against the steering wheel, his jaw locked so tightly it looked almost painful. He hadn't spoken a single word since they left the park, and the silence between them was deafening. Emily sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring out the window as if the passing streetlights could somehow offer her clarity. Inside, her thoughts swirled chaotically, grasping for an explanation that could mend the rift forming between them. But every possible answer felt hollow. When they finally arrived home, the tension didn't break, it only thickened. The moment the door closed behind them, Ryan spun to face her, his movements sharp and purposeful, his eyes aflame with an intensity that made her flinch. Start talking, he commanded, his voice cutting through the air like steel. Emily froze, her throat dry and her mind blank under the weight of his anger. Ryan, don't you dare, he interrupted, his voice rising, the edge of betrayal sharpening his words. Don't you dare feed me some excuse. What the hell were you doing with him? Alone in the middle of the night? In the rain? Her voice cracked as she faltered, unable to find a foothold in the swirling chaos of her thoughts. We were just talking. Ryan's laugh was harsh, devoid of humor, a sound that made her stomach turn. That didn't look like just talking, Emily. She took an involuntary step back, her pulse racing as her mind scrambled for the right words. Ryan, please. It wasn't anything. He's been going through a rough time lately. He needed someone to talk to. Someone to talk to? Ryan repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. His eyes narrowed as he took a step closer. And that someone had to be you? In the middle of a park? At night? Without telling me? Do you think I'm an idiot? No, of course not, Emily exclaimed, her voice breaking under the weight of his accusation. I didn't plan for this, Ryan. It just happened. Ryan's expression darkened, his disbelief giving way to something sharper, more dangerous. What exactly happened, Emily? His voice dropped to a low, icy tone that sent shivers down her spine. Because from where I was standing, it looked like you were. Don't, Emily cut him off, her voice barely above a whisper, trembling with the weight of the moment. Don't say it. Ryan shook his head slowly, his initial anger subsiding, replaced by something far deeper, something raw and unspoken that sent a cold twist through Emily's stomach. His eyes bore into hers, a mixture of hurt and disbelief etched on his face. Do you have any idea how this looks? How it makes me feel? He asked, his voice low but trembling with restrained emotion. Emily felt her throat tighten as tears welled up in her eyes, threatening to spill over. I wasn't trying to hurt you, she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her guilt. I swear, Ryan. I wasn't. Then what were you trying to do? He asked, his voice breaking as he struggled to contain his emotions. Because right now, I don't even know who you are. The words cut through her like a blade. Emily felt herself unraveling, her carefully constructed walls crumbling into dust. Her voice quivered as she replied, I don't know who I am either, Ryan. I've been so lost for years. Ryan shook his head again, his anger flaring momentarily as he interrupted her. No. Don't turn this around on me. This isn't about me. Isn't it? Emily shot back, her voice rising with desperation. You're never here, Ryan. You barely look at me anymore. Do you even realize how lonely I've been? How invisible I feel? He stared at her, his expression unreadable, but his silence was loud enough to fill the room. Finally, he spoke, his voice edged with bitterness. So you turned to him. It wasn't like that, Emily's voice cracked as her desperation spilled over. I didn't mean for it to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't plan any of this. Ryan's silence stretched on, heavier than any words could have been. The disappointment in his eyes was palpable, a weight she felt pressing against her chest. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but distant, like a door quietly closing. I need time, he said flatly. Time to think. I'm sleeping in the guest room tonight. Emily reached out instinctively, but he had already turned away. Ryan, she called after him, her voice a fragile plea. He didn't respond. She watched him walk down the hall, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the house. The click of the guest room door shutting behind him felt like the sound of something breaking, something that might never be repaired. Left alone, Emily let out a shaky breath, her tears finally falling freely. She sank into the nearest chair, her head in her hands as the weight of her actions bore down on her. The lines she had crossed, blurred in the heat of the moment, now came into sharp, unforgiving focus. Every second that passed seemed to deepen her regret, the enormity of what she had done pressing down on her chest. Narrator's note, oh, Emily. This is the part where the consequences start to hit. The guilt, the regret, it's all crashing down. And Ryan? He's not just angry. He's hurt. Deeply. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. Ryan was gone. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she entered the kitchen and saw a note on the counter. The hastily scrawled words stared back at her. Gone to clear my head. Don't call me. Her breath caught in her throat as she read and reread the note. The emptiness of the house felt suffocating, amplifying the hollow in her chest. She knew she had no right to feel angry or betrayed, no right to demand anything from him after what she had done. But the loneliness was unbearable. Her phone buzzed, the vibration cutting through the silence like a sharp knife. She hesitated before picking it up, her hand trembling as she saw the name on the screen. Jake. She almost didn't open the message, but her curiosity, or maybe her guilt, got the better of her. Are you okay? I'm sorry about last night. Please let me know if you're all right. Emily stared at the words, her emotions swirling in a chaotic storm. She knew what she had to do. She had to end this, once and for all. Her fingers hovered over the screen for what felt like an eternity before she finally typed out a reply. I'm fine. But we can't do this anymore, Jake. Please understand. The response came almost instantly, his persistence refusing to waver. I can't stop thinking about you. I know I messed up, but I can't walk away from this. Emily sighed, her heart sinking further. She wanted to block his number, to erase the mistake entirely, but the damage had already been done. And now, she was left to face the wreckage. Narrators aside, this is the part where you realize there's no easy way out. No clean break. Just a mess that keeps getting messier. Emily closed her eyes, her heart aching with a depth that felt almost physical. She knew the decision she had to make, the one that would alter everything. But the very thought of losing Jake, the way he made her feel, the connection they shared, was almost unbearable. The days that followed blurred into one long, suffocating fog of avoidance and guilt. Ryan, sensing the tension, kept his distance, leaving Emily to drown in her own thoughts. She tried to immerse herself in household chores, tasks that would keep her hands busy and her mind occupied. But it was no use. Every time her phone buzzed, a jolt of panic shot through her chest. Her heart leapt into her throat, torn between a gut-wrenching dread of what might be and a flicker of hope. Each message was a cruel reminder of the turmoil she was living. Then, one quiet afternoon, a knock at the door shattered the fragile routine she had so desperately tried to maintain. Her breath caught in her throat as she opened the door to find Jake standing there, his presence filling the space with a mix of defiance and longing. His expression was a perfect reflection of the emotional storm inside her. "I needed to see you," he said, his voice firm, carrying an urgency that left no room for doubt. "Jake, this isn't a good idea," Emily replied, her voice shaky as she glanced nervously down the street, hoping no one would see. The weight of her secrets felt heavier with each passing second. "I don't care," he said, stepping into the house with determination. "I can't just walk away from this. You mean too much to me." "Jake, stop," Emily whispered, her voice trembling with the intensity of the emotions she could no longer keep at bay. "You don't understand what this is doing to me, to my marriage. It's tearing me apart inside." "I do understand," he replied, his tone softening as he took a step closer. "And I hate that I'm the one causing you this pain. But I can't pretend that I don't feel the way I do. I can't just erase it." Emily turned away, her hands shaking as she fought to keep her composure. "You're so young. You don't understand what you're saying. This isn't just about us. It's not just about you and me." Her voice cracked, and she pressed her palm against her forehead, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. "I know exactly what I'm saying," Jake replied, stepping closer still, his gaze intense. "I'm saying that I care about you more than I've ever cared about anyone. And I can't pretend otherwise." His words hung in the air like a promise, sincere and raw, and Emily's chest tightened with the emotion flooding her. She wanted to believe him, to lose herself in the warmth he offered, to forget the world outside the room. But she knew it wasn't that simple. It never was. "Jake," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "This has to stop. This can't keep going on." "Why?" he asked, his voice cracking with emotion. "Because it's wrong. Because it's not supposed to be like this. Because people wouldn't understand," she responded, her voice wavering between the guilt and the fear that gnawed at her. "I don't care about any of that," Jake said, his voice steady and determined. "I care about you. That's all that matters." Tears began to spill down Emily's cheeks as she turned to face him. "It's not just about what other people think," she said, her voice breaking with raw emotion. "It's about what I think. About how I feel about myself right now. And right now, I hate myself for what I've done. For what I've allowed to happen. I never should have let it go this far." Jake reached out, his hand gently brushing her cheek, his touch soft and comforting. "You don't have to hate yourself. You're human, Emily. We all make mistakes. And you deserve to be happy, no matter how complicated things get." Emily closed her eyes, her heart aching in a way she couldn't explain. "This isn't happiness," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is chaos. And it's tearing me apart from the inside out." Jake's hand slowly dropped to his side, his shoulders slumping in quiet defeat. "If this is what you want," he said, his voice hollow, "then I'll go. But I need you to know. I love you. And I always will." Emily watched him turn and walk toward the door, her heart breaking with every step he took. She wanted to call out to him, to take back every word, every action, to pull him back and tell him that she couldn't let him go, that she wasn't ready to lose him. But the words died in her throat, the weight of her choices pressing down on her, silent and suffocating. She stayed still, rooted to the spot, as the door clicked shut behind him. Narrator's note: "Oh, this is the part where it really hits you. The finality of it. Emily's trying to do the right thing, but you can feel the cost. It's not just Jake walking away, it's a piece of her, too." That evening, Ryan returned home. There was no fanfare, no conversation. He simply sat down at the kitchen table, his eyes distant and unfocused, as though he had already sensed the change in the air. The silence between them felt endless, a chasm that no words could bridge. "I'm so sorry," Emily said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, trembling with the weight of the words. "For everything." Ryan turned to look at her, his gaze unwavering, but his face was a mask, unreadable, betraying no emotion. "Are you really?" he asked, his tone flat, distant, as though the question itself had lost its meaning after everything that had transpired. "Yes," Emily replied, her voice cracking, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. Each drop was a silent testament to the anguish she felt. "I don't want to lose you, Ryan. I know I've made mistakes, but I swear, I'll do whatever it takes to fix this, to make things right between us." Ryan let out a long, weary sigh, his shoulders slumping with the exhaustion of the moment. He ran a hand through his hair before speaking again. "I don't know if we can fix this, Emily," he said, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "But I'm willing to try. For us. For what we had, if there's any chance left of salvaging it." Emily nodded, though her heart felt as though it was being torn in two. A wave of guilt flooded her chest, but there was also a flicker of hope, that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild what had been broken. She knew the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but she was willing to fight for their love. Yet, beneath the surface of her regret, a troubling thought lingered, a thought she couldn't push away. Jake, the man who had made her feel alive in ways she had never imagined. A part of her heart still ached for him, even as she desperately clung to the hope that she could fix things with Ryan. The days that followed were suffocating in their silence. Emily moved through the house, feeling the absence of warmth between them. Ryan was there, but his presence was no longer a source of comfort. It felt as though they were strangers sharing the same space, each of them careful not to disturb the fragile truce they had found. Conversations had become strained, forced, and empty. Emily tried to show him, in whatever small way she could, that she was committed to making amends, cooking his favorite meals, tidying the house with an extra sense of care. But no matter what she did, the distance between them seemed to grow, a chasm that threatened to swallow them whole. Narrators aside, this is the part where you realize that fixing something broken isn't just about saying sorry. It's about rebuilding trust, and that's a lot harder than it sounds. Then, on a bright, sunlit afternoon, when the air was warm and the world outside seemed to continue on as usual, Ryan finally spoke. Emily was in the kitchen, absently wiping down the counters, lost in her thoughts, when she heard his footsteps approaching. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, his expression grim, his eyes hard with a quiet intensity. "We need to talk," he said, his voice calm but unwavering, the words carrying a weight that made her stomach twist. Emily's heart skipped a beat, dread curling in her chest. "Okay," she said, her voice tight, trying to mask the panic she felt rising inside her. Without saying another word, Ryan pulled out a chair from the table and sat down, his posture stiff, his hands resting on his knees as if he was bracing himself. He motioned for her to sit across from him, his eyes not leaving hers. Emily wiped her hands nervously on a dish towel before reluctantly sitting down, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence between them stretched on, feeling as though every moment, every breath, was building towards something inevitable, something they both feared but knew was coming. "I've been thinking," Ryan began, his fingers drumming against the table in a rhythmic, anxious pattern. "About us. About everything that happened." His voice was low, filled with an unease that lingered in the air between them. Emily opened her mouth as if to say something, but he quickly held up a hand, his palm flat, to stop her. "Let me finish," he insisted, his voice firm yet weary. She nodded, the weight of his words pressing heavily on her chest, a suffocating tightness that refused to loosen. "I know I haven't been the husband you deserve," he said, his voice cracking slightly, the admission hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. Ryan continued, his tone softer now, almost regretful. "I've been distant, always lost in work, caught up in everything else. And in doing so, I failed to make you feel truly seen, truly loved. And for that, I am so sorry." Emily felt tears well in her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away, unwilling to interrupt. The lump in her throat was too thick to speak, but she needed him to know she heard him. "But what happened with Jake?" Ryan trailed off, his words hanging in the air like a storm ready to break. "That's not something I can just forget. It's like you shattered something between us, Emily. And I don't even know if it's possible to fix it." "I know," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible as it cracked with emotion. "And I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. I swear, Ryan. I will." Ryan's gaze locked onto hers, his eyes heavy with a mixture of sorrow and pain. He stared at her for what felt like an eternity before speaking again. "I need to know something," he said, his voice rough. "Do you love him?" The question hit her with the force of a physical blow, a punch to the gut. She wanted to say no, to tell him that it meant nothing, that Jake was just a fleeting mistake, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she lowered her gaze, the silence between them filling the space like an unbearable weight. Her lack of response answered his question without her needing to say a word. Ryan let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head slowly, his eyes dark with hurt. "That's what I thought," he muttered, the words laced with disbelief. "It's not what you think," Emily quickly protested, her voice trembling. "I care about him, but it's not love. It's complicated." "Complicated?" Ryan repeated, his voice rising with disbelief. "He's my nephew, Emily. Do you have any idea what this has done to me? To us? To everything we had? I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Emily sobbed, tears freely flowing now as she struggled to find the words. "I was so lonely, Ryan. I felt invisible in our marriage. And Jake made me feel alive again. Like I mattered. Like I was someone worth noticing. And what about me?" Ryan demanded, his voice rising with frustration, anger now edging in. "Do I mean so little to you that you'd throw everything we built away for a fling?" "It wasn't a fling," Emily said, her voice cracking with shame. "It was a mistake, Ryan. A terrible, selfish mistake. And I hate myself for it." Ryan stopped pacing, his body stiffening as he turned to face her, his eyes hard and accusing. "You're damn right it was. And now we both have to live with it," he said, his words cold and final. Narrator's note: this is the part where it all comes crashing down. The truth is out, and there's no taking it back. The damage is done, and you can feel the weight of it in every word. The fallout from their conversation was swift and painful. Ryan packed a bag that evening, not even looking at her as he left, leaving Emily to sit alone in the quiet house. She tried calling him, texting him, but his replies were sparse and curt. "I need space," he said. "I need time to think." Emily couldn't blame him. She spent her days wandering through the empty rooms of their house, haunted by the memories of her actions and the life she had destroyed. Every corner of the house seemed to echo with regret, every glance at her reflection a sharp reminder of the choices she had made. One evening, her phone buzzed. She hesitated before answering, her heart already sinking. It was a message from Jake. "I'm sorry for everything. I didn't mean to make things worse for you. But I need to know if you're okay." Emily stared at the screen, her heart aching with every word. She wanted to reply, to tell him she missed him, that he wasn't at fault. But she knew that responding would only make things harder for both of them. So, with a heavy heart, she set the phone down and walked away, each step taking her further from the past even as it clung to her. Narrators aside, this is where the real struggle begins. Emily's trying to move forward, but the past isn't letting go. And Jake? He's still there, a ghost she can't shake. Weeks turned into months, and the pain of it all didn't seem to fade. Ryan eventually returned, but things between them were different, distant. They spoke with the politeness of strangers sharing a space, but the warmth, the closeness, seemed irreparably gone. Counseling was suggested, but Ryan was indifferent, and Emily didn't press. She knew it would take more than just time to heal the wounds between them, and she wasn't sure if it was even possible. One afternoon, while shopping for groceries, Emily spotted Jake standing by his truck in the far corner of the parking lot. His posture was stiff, his expression unreadable as he leaned against the truck, his eyes catching hers. They stood there for a moment, neither of them moving, the silence between them thick with everything that had been left unsaid. Finally, Jake shoved his hands into his pockets and walked toward her. "Hi," he said, his voice quiet. "Hi," Emily replied softly, her voice barely audible. They stood in uncomfortable silence for a long moment, the background noise of the parking lot fading into nothing as their eyes met. "I heard Uncle Ryan came back," Jake said, his words soft and tentative. "He did," Emily said. We're trying." Jake nodded, his eyes dropping to the pavement beneath his feet. "That's good. I'm glad." The lump in Emily's throat tightened again. "I'm sorry, Jake," she whispered, "for everything." Jake looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and something deeper, something painful. "Me too," he said quietly. For a moment, Emily thought he might say more, might offer some comfort. But instead, he gave her a small, bittersweet smile before turning and walking away. She watched him go, her heart heavy with the knowledge that this was the end of whatever had been between them. The finality of it all settled in her chest like a stone. Narrator's note: this is the part where it really hits you. The goodbye. It's not dramatic or loud, it's quiet, like the end of something that was never meant to last, but it still hurts. That night, as Emily sat alone in the dim light of the living room, she stared at the family photo hanging on the wall. It was from years ago, a time before everything had fallen apart. The woman in the picture was someone she barely recognized now, her smile radiant and full of hope, unburdened by the weight of her mistakes. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Ryan. Late at work. Don't wait up. Emily sighed and set the phone down. She gazed out the window at the dark, quiet street, her reflection staring back at her from the glass. She didn't know what the future held, if her marriage could survive, or if she could ever forgive herself for what she'd done. But one thing was clear, she couldn't go back to the way things had been. She needed to find herself again, to rediscover who she was, even if that meant starting over. And maybe, just maybe, she would. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Before we say goodbye, if you haven't yet subscribed, I invite you to press the subscribe button. Your support, even if it seems like a small gesture, means a lot to us and drives us to continue creating content with heart. Don't forget to give it a like if you enjoyed what we shared today. Every interaction helps us grow and allows us to continue connecting with you through stories that matter. Thank you for being part of this community.